Grigori Rasputin was perhaps the most successful psychological vampire in human history. He didn't need a crown to rule Russia. He only needed to understand the terrifying void inside the hearts of its noble women. While the Russian army was being decimated on the front lines, the real war was being fought in the boudoirs of St. Petersburg, where the mad monk traded spiritual salvation for absolute carnal submission. Welcome to Society Noir. But before the Tsar's empire collapsed into the crimson tide of revolution, how did a Siberian illiterate become the most feared man in Europe without firing a single bullet? Imagine a society so obsessed with its own reflection that it couldn't see the predator standing in the room. Rasputin's Khlysty doctrine was a masterclass in elite manipulation. He turned the act of falling into the abyss into a religious requirement. He didn't offer a path to God. He offered a ticket to a hostile psychological takeover disguised as a miracle. We will dissect the chilling mechanics of his influence, from the intoxicating fumes of absolute power he exhaled to the way he used the Romanovs' darkest family secrets as his personal currency. You'll see how the most refined aristocrats in the world became obedient puppets for a man they should have despised. Stay with us as we reveal the sickening truth behind the Romanovs' final days, a story of how a single, toxic catalyst can turn a 1,000-year dynasty into a pile of ash. To understand Rasputin, you must first understand the stench of the Russian aristocracy in Mutnyin Chintrum Lair Num. It was a world of Fabergé eggs, stiff corsets, and a spiritual vacuum so vast it could swallow a continent. The elite were bored. They had exhausted every earthly pleasure and were now scavenging for mysticism like starving dogs. Enter the man from Pokrovskoye. He didn't arrive with the perfume of Versailles. He arrived smelling of unwashed wool, cheap tobacco, and the raw earth of the Siberian wilderness, to the pampered duchesses of St. Maini. Petersburg, this wasn't offensive, it was authentic. In their eyes, his filth was a sign of holiness. They were so disconnected from reality that they mistook a lack of hygiene for a direct pipeline to the divine. It was the first step of the parasite, making the host fall in love with the infection. The brilliance of Rasputin's manipulation lay in a twisted theological loophole, the Khlysty doctrine. Most religions tell you to be good to go to heaven. Rasputin told the bored elite something much more seductive. Drive your soul into the mud so that God has something to forgive. This was music to the ears of a nobility drowning in suppressed desires. He didn't just give them permission to sin, he made it a spiritual obligation. Imagine the scene. A dimly lit salon, the air thick with incense and the sweat of high society women, as this holy man whispers that their adultery and their lust are actually sacred labor. He turned the boudoir into a cathedral and the act of betrayal into a ritual of hoikai, repentance. It was a brilliant, predatory marketing campaign. The more you sin, the more you pray. The more you pray, the more you need Rasputin to facilitate the transaction. While the wives were being spiritually de-virginized, Rasputin secured his ultimate host, Empress Alexandra. Here, the parasite found its most potent weapon, maternal guilt. The young Tsarevich Alexei was bleeding to death from the inside, a victim of the royal malady, hemophilia. Every time the boy bumped his knee, the empire trembled. Science failed, doctors panicked, and in stepped the peasant. Whether through hypnosis, the sheer force of his charismatic presence, or simply by telling the doctors to stop giving the boy aspirin, which ironically thins the blood, Rasputin stopped the bleeding. At that moment, he became more than a monk. He became a biological necessity. To Alexandra, Rasputin was the only thing standing between her son and a coffin. He wasn't just an advisor, he was the life support system of the Romanov line. And once you control the life support, you control the patient. By Mutnyin Chintrum Lair, the Russian court had become a petri dish for Rasputin's toxic influence. The Tsar, Nicholas II, a man who would have been much happier as a quiet country gardener, was hopelessly outmatched. He watched as his ministers were fired and hired at the whim of a man who claimed to see visions in his vodka glass. The government became a revolving door of Rasputin's sycophants. It was a kakistocracy government by the worst, for the benefit of the most unholy. The traditional power structures of Russia, the military, the church, the Duma watched in horror as a Siberian peasant essentially became the Kotsar. The tragedy wasn't that Rasputin was evil. It was that the Romanovs were so psychologically fragile they couldn't survive without his poison. As the shadows of World War I began to stretch across the European continent, the Russian court transformed into a surreal theater of the absurd. St. Petersburg was no longer a city of laws. It was a city of whispers. Rasputin's private apartment became the unofficial capital of the empire. Here, the holy man held court in a room that smelled of heavy incense and unwashed skin, receiving a constant stream of petitioners. Generals traded military secrets for a blessing. Ministers offered their daughters' reputations for a seat in the cabinet. It was a bizarre economy where the currency was not gold, but proximity to the mad monk. This was the architecture of chaos, a system where the traditional hierarchy was dismantled and replaced by the whims of a man who claimed to talk to God but acted like a pimp for the first. Apocalypse. When the drums of war finally beat in Motnyin Chintrum Moy born, the Russian Empire marched toward its extinction with a blindfold on. While millions of peasants were being slaughtered in the trenches of the Eastern Front, the leadership in St. Petersburg was paralyzed by a mystical veto. Rasputin began dreaming of military strategies. He whispered into the Empress's ear, who then commanded the Tsar to fire competent generals and replace them with spineless loyalists. It was a masterpiece of accidental sabotage. The Russian army wasn't just fighting the Germans, it was fighting a ghost in the palace. Every defeat on the battlefield was seen by the public not as a failure of logistics, but as a direct result of the German woman, the Empress, and her demon. The monarchy was bleeding out, and Rasputin was the one holding the scalpel, claiming he was just trying to stop the pain. The irony of Rasputin's holy sins reached its peak during the darkest days of the war. While the city starved and bread lines stretched for miles, the secret parties of the elite grew more desperate and more depraved. This was the Saturnalia of blood. In private mansions, the Khlysty rituals became more frequent, a frantic attempt to find meaning in a world that was clearly ending. Rasputin was the conductor of this orchestra of ruin. He encouraged the elite to shed their dignity as easily as their clothes, convinced that the only way to survive the coming storm was to become as pure as a beast. It was a collective psychological breakdown disguised as a spiritual awakening. The upper class wasn't just dancing on the edge of a volcano, they were inviting the lava inside for a drink. The most chilling aspect of this forensic autopsy is the sheer indifference of the Tsar. Nicholas II lived in a bubble of domestic bliss, protected from reality by the steel walls of his own denial. To him, Rasputin was a friend who kept his wife calm and his son alive. He ignored the frantic warnings from his secret police. He ignored the pleas from his own family to banish the monk. This wasn't just bad leadership, it was a complete dissociation from the crown. The Tsar had abdicated his mind long before he abdicated his throne. By allowing Rasputin to remain, he turned the Russian monarchy into a joke, and in Russia, once you become a joke, the only punchline is a firing squad. The demon's ritual was complete. The host had been fully consumed, leaving only a hollow shell of an empire waiting for a spark to ignite. By late Motnyin Chintrum Moisao, the Russian elite realized that if they didn't kill the parasite, the host would die. But here is the irony. The men who set out to save the monarchy were the very ones who personified its incompetence. Led by Prince Felix Yusupov, a man so wealthy he was bored of his own skin, the conspirators invited Rasputin to a basement for a party. This wasn't a military operation, it was a desperate, clumsy attempt at an exorcism. They offered him cakes and wine laced with enough cyanide to kill a cavalry troop. And then they waited. But the demon didn't die. He ate, he drank, and he asked for more. This is the moment where history blurs into a horror film. To the terrified aristocrats, it seemed as though the poison was merely an appetizer for the man who had already swallowed the Russian Empire whole. Panicked by the supernatural resilience of their victim, Yusupov shot Rasputin in the chest. They thought it was over. But as the prince leaned over the corpse, the monk's eyes snapped open two glowing coals of raw Siberian willpower. He lunged, clawing at his assassin, and crawled out into the snow-covered courtyard. It took multiple bullets, a brutal beating with a rubber truncheon, and finally, being bound and thrown into the frozen Malaya Nevka River to finish the job. When his body was recovered, Legend says his lungs were filled with water. He was still breathing when he hit the ice. The holy man didn't just die, he had to be deleted from reality. But killing the man was easy. Killing the chaos he had unleashed was impossible. The death of Rasputin didn't save the Romanovs. It was the final signature on their death warrant. Without their shield, the Tsar and Empress were exposed to the full, icy gale of public hatred. Within months, the monarchy collapsed. The final scene of this Society Noir doesn't take place in a palace, but in a damp basement in Yekaterinburg, the Ipatiev house. In Mutngin Chintram, the Romanov family was lined up for a photograph that turned into a massacre. As the bullets flew, something strange happened. The Grand Duchesses seemed bulletproof. It wasn't a miracle, it was their diamonds. They had sewn so many jewels into their corsets, the symbols of their opulent status, that the gems acted as a makeshift armor, ricocheting the bullets back at the executioners. They were literally being killed by their own wealth. In the end, the demon's ritual achieved its goal. Rasputin had promised that as long as he lived, the dynasty would survive. He was right, but not for the reasons the Empress believed. He was the toxic glue holding a shattered mirror together. When he fell, the glass didn't just break. It turned into 1,000,000 shards that cut the throats of the very people who had worshipped him. The story of Rasputin isn't about a monk with magical powers. It's a forensic study of what happens when the elite lose their connection to reality and start seeking salvation in the gutter. The Romanovs didn't lose their empire to the Bolsheviks. They lost it the moment they let a holy monster tell them that their sins were the only way to God.